where we discuss the biggest developments across the globe in the last 7 days. And our top focus today, of course, is the interim government announcement by the Taliban in Afghanistan. Many controversial names in the cabinet, several hardliners, predominantly all of them are Taliban and far from the inclusive government that they had promised. Some of the controversial names are Sirajuddin Haqqani, the leader of the Haqqani network presently. He's the interiors minister, and his uncle, Khalil Haqqani, has been named the acting minister for refugees. We are discussing this, of course, with our guest and expert, Devesh Singh Maini. Sir, what are your top takeaways from the new interim government?
Thank you very much at the outset. So there are a couple of things. The first is that, for the time being, analysts obviously rightly have argued that the Doha group has been sort of outmaneuvered. If you look at the composition, the relatively more moderate faction, the Taliban. So if you look at the choice of the leader, if you look at even the composition of the cabinet, that is one thing that the Doha group has been, for the time being at least, it seems that they have not had their way. Second thing is, when you look at it from the geopolitics of South Asia itself, obviously the visit of the ISI chief only a few days earlier has not gone unnoticed, and there's a clear sort of Pakistani imprint on the composition of the cabinet, on the government. Right, that's one part of it. But the second is that, so this is the geopolitics that that when you look at the Doha group, when you look at the Pakistani imprint, but Taliban itself still has its own compulsions. They've made, so while on the one hand they've stuck to their conventional stance on certain issues, on the other they've said that they need to have good relations. They need to even have good relations with the US itself, and obviously there are economic constraints involved. So I would put it this way, that obviously some of the signaling is not correct. People would be slightly uncomfortable with certain choices, and especially the Haqqani connection doesn't send out the right signals. But then at the same time, it's all about each country has to see its own interests, and you have to deal with whoever is there. So the only hope can be that, given that they have their own economic constraints, there will be a certain amount of moderation, and that some of the announcements which they're making are basically directed more towards a gallery or towards their supporters, So that's how I would look at it. But yes, I think even if you look at the great powers, and China is not also saying it openly, but I'm sure even China is not comfortable with the composition. As far as Pakistan is concerned, obviously there's a clear imprint. So as I said, each country has its own interests and they view different, but largely the signaling has not been correct in many ways.
All right. So it's an interim government. There are chances that some new faces, or that there can be some shuffling also. So the next question is related to Qatar. It's been an important mediator between the West and the Taliban, and its role was also acknowledged recently by the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. He visited the country recently. However, so what do you think of Qatar's role vis-a-vis Afghanistan's immediate neighbors? How much influence can Qatar still wield? And can it still be this channel of communication between the West and the Taliban? What are your thoughts?
The US Secretary of State, during his visit to Qatar, he reiterated on the one hand, the strategic importance, and also about the fact that Qatar had helped in evacuating a large number of US citizens and citizens of other countries also who were stranded in Afghanistan. So that role has been recognized, and Qatar is going to be, as we have discussed in earlier shows also, an important sort of intermediary for a number of countries, because in recent days it has enhanced its diplomatic role, and it has been quite proactive towards, and it can balance out different camps in that sense. So that way it's astute. So that role is given. The other thing which is interesting to note is also that there was talk about the fact that post the withdrawal of troops, US troops, that Turkey is going to be guarding the airport, Kabul airport. But now there are indicators that Qatar has said that there are apparently in talks with Taliban that Qatar will be handling the Kabul airport. So in that sense, this becomes very important. But at the same time, I would also like to say that, this is also going to lead to some sort of tussle between different countries. So, for instance, as I said, the Doha group, obviously Qatar also has more leverage vis-a-vis them. So, for the time being, one would believe that they've been weakened. On the other hand, Pakistan has had, so far, it has managed to sort of have some imprint. So, in that sense, how does that play out? And secondly, even within the, if you look at it regionally, is this going to lead to, again, rivalries within the Middle East? Because, like, for instance, say between Qatar and other Arab countries, how are they going to take it? So that is something which you need to look at. Pakistan on its part would also, be closely watching, the way, because for a number of countries which are wary of Pakistan and China, Qatar is very important. If you look at, in fact, along with, maybe it's one of the most important players in that sense, maybe Russia, but Russia obviously is in the Chinese orbit, so it can only go so much against, but Qatar, that was very important. So I think from numerous perspectives, and I would add that basically, apart from the strategic part, I think the way, if you look at the evacuations and things like that, I think basically Qatar has illustrated the relevance of smart power, blend of the soft power and hard power. So the way it's evacuated, and as it is in recent days, it's, if you look at it within the GCC, it's one of the countries which has been trying to enhance its soft power as well. So the way it's handled the current situation is clearly an illustration of how, smart power works, and also a fact that, we always talk about punching above your weight, to outmaneuver other GCC countries and to play a more important role is really creditable. And I think the next, simply put, in the short run, the next rivalry, to some extent, I think, for instance, if Qatar plays a more important role, even Turkey is not going to be that comfortable, because, as I said, in the context of specifically guarding the Kabul airport, Turkey had earlier wanted to sort of do it. So that also remains to be seen. Of course, now in the short run, each country has to, there are security interests, there are evacuations which need to be done and things like that. So these things will play out in the longer run.
So, and lastly, China has been seeking some common ground with Iran as far as Afghanistan rebuilding the country is concerned. What are your thoughts in both these nations partnering up?
Okay. So first of all, very interesting remarks made by the US president yesterday, that China will deal, basically he has referred to the fact that China is not comfortable with the Taliban, but it will work out some arrangement with the Taliban. So that, again, last couple of weeks, on the one hand, we've been speaking about the zero sum between China and the US. So on the other, obviously, when the US realizes China's importance, and vice versa. So that's something which you need to look at, that it's easy for media channels and for when you look at foreign policy from a very simplistic lens to make it zero sum. But unlike, the earlier times, like, for instance, during the Cold War, when we looked at the US, then USSR and US rivalry, at this point of time, the situation is very different. So first, there's a clear realization by Beijing also that it needs to work with other countries, as I had said in earlier shows, and now not just with the US, not just with Russia, but even with the US. That's one thing. Second, if you look at the conversation with between the Chinese foreign minister and his Iranian counterpart, there he has spoken about an important role for Iran, and obviously that Beijing and Tehran need to work together. Now, there is some overlap, because if you look at some of the connectivity initiatives, if you look at the 25-year strategic agreement which China and Iran signed in March 2021, there are, some of the projects are linked to the BRI, and they may dovetail with some of the initiatives which the Chinese also want to undertake in Afghanistan. So there is that, China, Afghanistan, Iran sort of trilateral. That's one part of it. But is Iran going to play ball with China totally? No, because Iran has in fact said that it wants to work with India. And if you look at even the statement of Stanik Zai, who has now been appointed as a deputy foreign minister, he had even referred to the Chabahar port. That that basically that this Chabahar port, which India looks at, and Iran and Afghanistan look at as an important symbol of trilateral connectivity. So he has referred to the Chabahar port. India has been giving more importance to the Chabahar port, and Iran, of course, on its own part also has given indicators that wants India obviously to sort of expedite the projects on the ground, that the pace of implementation should be faster. So Iran is placed in a very interesting situation that it needs to, on the one hand, unless the relationship with the US witnesses an improvement, obviously it has to be close to China. But on the other, Iran also wants to assert its own independence in foreign policy, and there it has to work together with India. And Iran also made a statement, by the way, about external interference in Afghanistan. So it made a reference. In that sense, it was alluding to Pakistan. And while due to the geopolitics within the region, due to the tensions between Iran and the US, Iran has also had to, willy-nilly, because of some geopolitical changes, Iran and Pakistan relations witnessed an upswing. But on the other hand, there were very important security issues as well. So I think Iran's role, like Qatar, like I said, as a go-between, as an intermediary, Iran, in a different sense, has a very important role to play. And I would also sort of reiterate that, obviously, when we look at the situation in Afghanistan, the focus is always on, the great powers. It's always on power transition that, the US has left. Now China will suddenly take over. It's about, we always look at, who's the thing, that this whole notion of a hegemon and all that. But in the current situation in Afghanistan, it's those concepts can be used to some extent, but they are inadequate to explain the current situation. And you have other countries now which have an important role to play. Now, I won't say exactly that, that there are pivot states, but they're important. So both, in that sense, one GCC country, which we had spoken about, Qatar and Iran, have an important role to play. And this will have its impact, with these Middle Eastern countries being important. This will also have an impact on the politics, on the geopolitics of the Middle East. And this also raises questions about whether even Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain will also redefine their geopolitics. Currently, their apprehension is about, the rise of, like Iran is worried about the rise of Sunni extremism. Even obviously, when the GCC countries themselves have been trying to, put forward a different sort of narrative, and the model of governance and things like that is different. So they are also apprehensive about the Taliban. But in the long run, the increasing clout of countries like Qatar and Iran is going to have a very strong impact on, the geopolitics within the Middle East, specifically within the Gulf.
Devesh Singh Maini, sir, thanks very much for joining us this week, for your perspective, and look forward to having you with us next week as well.
My pleasure. Thank you.